A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, the federal election campaign's bubbling along. Everyone's talking about tariffs. We won't talk much about that today. There is point scoring happening on every side. People jostling to get their issues into the limelight of the campaign. You can't help but feel there are likely to be many who would name themselves as Christian but who have no interest in the election that's coming. Well, we might ask ourselves, does Jesus even care about the Australian federal election? Christian commentator David Robertson is back with us for his reflection on Christians and the upcoming election. Hey, David, a special welcome back to 2020.
With you, nice discussing this subject, to which I can bring due impartiality because I'm not allowed to vote. So.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll hold you to that. Due impartiality, because you're a Scotsman, you haven't got your citizenship worked out here for Australia. So, yes, coming with a bit of a commentary from a neutral position in some sense. I think the listeners will be able to work that out. Hey, just before we get into this, there are some fringe parts that call themselves Christian who don't vote. Some of those we might even call them cults, but separating faith from worldly politics. Let me just ask you beforehand, I think it's a pretty standard thing. Christians take that stewardship responsibility to vote, but what about those who don't vote at all for all sorts of religious reasons? Any just quick thought from you, David?
Well, let each be persuaded in their own mind. I mean, there are people who don't vote because they can't think of anyone worth voting for. In Australia, of course, it's compulsory to vote. So, it's funny for me. I don't get to vote, but I pay taxes. So there is taxation without representation. But I think, for me, Christians should vote anyway because it's part of our responsibility as citizens. I suspect that unless you go and live on a desert island somewhere and have nothing to do with anyone else, you are part of community and society, and we're a democracy, and what is decided affects you and affects many other people, and therefore I think we have a responsibility to vote.
Okay, let me put you on the spot and put your impartiality to the test. So Christians are going to vote. There is that responsibility, as you say. So who should we vote for?
Well, that's becoming increasingly difficult to answer. First of all, I don't think Christians or any Christian church or organization should endorse any particular political party. I know that there are situations where there are parties, like in the Netherlands, for example, that are specifically Christian. But I don't think that we should be going around telling people they should vote Liberal or National or Labour or Green or whatever. I think we can talk about what we're looking for in candidates, and I think we can talk about policies and so on. I have to say, in my own context, when I was in Scotland, I was getting to a stage where I was almost just putting protest votes, voting for ridiculous parties who would never get elected just because I was so fed up with the main parties. And I'm sure many people can identify with that. I think the other problem with the Australian system is you have elections every 3 years, which is like insane. You've got, it's like nobody ever gets anything done. You're always in election mode. And I think people get bored and fed up with it. So for me, there's no way you would get me to say that Christians should vote for a particular political party. I can tell you personally what my preferences would be in terms of there are issues which would kind of be red line issues for me. I think there are basic principles that we can talk about. I think there are a thing that we do that's even more important than voting is praying, as Paul says to Timothy, for kings and those in authority. And I think that should be the case primarily. Actually, our primary responsibility is to pray, but we should certainly act upon our prayers. So no, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you who not to vote for.
Okay, so, and this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because, and we've had these sorts of conversations too, and other guests on 2020, very happy to put the boot in both sides. And when you hear the boot being put in both sides, and, I'm talking about a street fighting type of terminology there, but we are interested in talking about the policies. And the policies, when they become the priority, typically we're going to say whoever is vying for election, we're going to cast our vote for the best of a bad bunch. Any thoughts there? Because some people have rose-coloured glasses around who they might vote for. What are your thoughts?
Well, I remember watching, and I won't say who they were, a well-known Christian commentator who, at the end of a particular election, was rejoicing that the world was saved and had never been so happy. And this was an Australian election. And I thought, well, someone's got slightly disconnected from reality, because what happens in Australian elections doesn't really have much to do with saving the world. And look, there's a verse in the Psalms: "Trust not in princes." We've got to not make politics the new religion. However, we have to avoid the other extreme that you're talking about, which I think is continually degrading politicians and demeaning and attacking and so on. There are many politicians who are giving their lives to serve the community. And, from a Christian perspective, we need to remember that according to Paul in Romans, politicians are God's servants. So, that's a pretty important deal for me. And therefore, it's important who we get as the leaders. Sometimes I think God sends us people to judge us. That definitely does happen. And other times I think we get people in mercy, who are much better than we deserve. But I do think that we have to avoid the extremes of relying on politicians, even if they're Christian ones, and or just denigrating politicians, and therefore we can be superior and smug without ever having to make any of the decisions they have to make.
Let me throw you a curly one that really comes from one of your colleagues in the Presbyterian Church. His name's David Burke, and he's got an article online at the moment asking, how would Jesus vote in the coming Australian election? Now, I'll tell you what his response is, and I'll get your thoughts on it. His response was, we don't know how Jesus would vote, so it's best not to guess. Such guesses invariably remake Jesus after our own image. Now, maybe you have to think that through a little, but what are your immediate thoughts on, how would Jesus vote?
Well, it's always interesting, isn't it, that people invent their own personal Jesus, who amazingly seems to have exactly the same thoughts as they do. So, I agree with David on that. I think, actually, on reflection, what he said would indicate that, first of all, to those who say you shouldn't vote, Jesus would vote, because he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and it's the law in Australia that you vote. So you would vote. How he would vote, David's right. I don't think we would know. I cannot see Jesus voting for example, anyone who would advocate the killing of innocent human beings. That for me would be something. I cannot see Jesus voting for somebody who advocated gross immorality or injustice. But the problem that we have is that elections are not single issue elections. So we're not voting on one particular issue. So you may find yourself voting for somebody who doesn't share your view on a particular subject, but they're actually better than their opponent. So it's not that we're voting for policies. We're being given a choice. And we need, I think it's a mistake to just vote for the not you like the most, but to vote against somebody. I'll vote for anyone as long as they're not that person. I think we should look at the policies, and maybe sometimes you do end up doing a protest vote. I think it's legal to go into a voting booth and say none of the above, make a mark to spoil your paper. So you could do that. But for me, I just tend to look, I've long ago given up on political parties. I now tend to look at the candidates. And I personally used to do this old-fashioned thing of going to hustings and listening to people. and deciding whether I'd vote for them on that basis. In fact, my own church here, we're arranging a hustings for the Newcastle area, and I hope that Christians will support that and come along and ask the candidates questions.
Something else David Burke said, and he reflected, I think, something quite accurate. It used to be that here in Australia, you'd have division within the Christian church. You'd have Protestants voting for one party, and you'd have Roman Catholics voting for another. Is that something that you grew up with in Scotland, or is that something unique to Australia, do you think? No, just about to say that doesn't actually, I don't think that exists anymore, by the way, but yes. But any reflection there from your own upbringing?
Yeah, I don't think that it's unique to Australia. I mean, I think you'd still get that in Ireland, for example, or at least in Northern Ireland. In Scotland, you did get, Catholics in Glasgow would tend to vote for Labour. Recently, it's been much more for the SNP, but I don't think you get that nearly as much. I mean, what is interesting in terms of in Australia as well as other religions is who do Muslims vote for? Because unlike Christianity, Islam doesn't see a division between faith and politics. And that's going to be a very interesting dynamic. I mean, traditionally, they would have voted for the Labour Party here in Australia, but increasingly there's talk of independent candidates standing up opposed to Labour. So no, I don't think there's a religious divide within Christianity about who you vote for, but I do think religion will play an impact, possibly through other religions.
What are your thoughts about what's woke and what's not? If you're trying to make sense of policies and parties and candidates, people get easily categorised. As Christians, maybe we've got a better idea of what's woke because we might be more across some issues, but then I imagine there's an awful lot of Christians who are not really across all of these sorts of things either. But what are your thoughts? What's woke, what's not, as a way to discern?
Well, in North Sydney, I was outside our Tarman station, just, I'd come off the train, and there were people campaigning for, I think, the Labour candidate, or it might have been the Independent. And I just went up to them. I didn't tell them I couldn't vote. So to try and get them to persuade me to vote, I asked about their policies. And I said, I do have one question for you. And they were like, can your candidate say what a woman is? And the answer was, they didn't know. And I said, well, I can't vote for someone who doesn't know what a woman is, And so that is what I would regard as I'm not voting for anybody who cannot tell me what a woman is. I think that's fairly fundamental. I also would not vote for anyone who would want to close Christian schools or who doesn't recognize the right of parents to have children educated according to their own faith. And I wouldn't vote for a racist. And I would not vote for somebody who supported abortion on demand up to 9 months. And it would be very difficult for me to vote for somebody who supported euthanasia as well. Now, it may be that if I've got 4 candidates, all of whom support euthanasia, I have to choose the lesser of the 4 evils. But I would be very reluctant to do it. So I think there are certain issues for me. I won't vote for a racist, but equally, I will not vote for somebody who supports, who can't say what a woman is or supports abortion on demand and so on. So, I mean, there's a useful website that the ACL have and others have that tell you what particular candidates and party policies are. One of the things that's changed in societies, it used to be in Western societies, like the UK, Australia and others, that parties had policies that were based on economics, social factors or whatever. And there were things that what they called matters of conscience. So they allowed individuals to have a free vote on things like abortion. But increasingly parties are adopting policies which are, they would say progressive, I think is regressive. And I find difficulty if a candidate belongs to a party which has a particular policy that I feel strongly against. I might still vote for them, but only on the condition that they would be a rebel, So who knows?
Come back to our motivation for voting as Christian believers, because as Christians we are called to love the Lord our God, all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, everything about loving God. Second command, just like it, love your neighbour as yourself. tendency is to think of ourselves when we're thinking of the policies that we might be presented with. What do you think we have as responsibility to our neighbour if we're thinking about policies when it comes to elections?
Well, there is an element of self-interest that comes in. For example, we want the economy to do well, because if the economy doesn't do well, then we're not likely to do well either. So there's an element of self-interest, which isn't wrong. But the kind of stuff, I mean, it amazes me that both of the main parties, it appears to me here, are offering ridiculous things and putting Australia into massive debt. And I want to think, well, what about my grandchildren? You know, two of whom are Aussie. You know, what kind of society will they be growing up? Is it one in which half the government income is being spent on paying off debt? You know, and so I think we need to think longer term. Politicians don't, and in Australia they only think 3 years. You know, which is crazy. I think we need to think longer term, and I think we need to forget ridiculous things like, hey, you're going to get $5 less in tax or something, and say, oh, I'll vote for them for that reason. No, I won't. I'll vote for them if their economic policy makes sense. And sometimes that might mean that I have to be prepared to take more of a hit. So, for example, I would have argued back in Scotland, I would have argued that there should have been a health tax for the health service, and that I should be prepared to pay for that. But I think if we're in a society where everyone's grabbing for what they can get, then that's going to disintegrate whatever happens. So Christians should exemplify saying, no, we don't want to be for that. And I think we should get away from virtue signaling politics as well. Oh, I'm going to vote for the party that supports refugees, let's say. Well, good. But how do they support them? What's the best thing for refugees? Which refugees? You know, in other words, we need to think deeper about these things. So for me, there are big issues in Australia just now. Education is a huge one. Health is a huge one. Freedom of religion is a huge one. And I'm not going to vote for anyone who threatens to take away the freedom of Christian schools to teach Christianity. That's another big issue.
There goes freedoms, if that happens. Hey, if we're taking this civic responsibility as Christian believers, we're wanting to engage, and some of us at different levels to others. A reflection, perhaps, just as we tie things together. Jeremiah said, you know, seek the welfare of the city. That might be something a little more localised than your national vote for a particular personality, a little bit of a US-style election campaigning, but the welfare of your city. Should we have a focus really around what's going on in our community, our electorate, to try and get things sorted and the right leadership in place? I guess you've got to balance things, but what are your thoughts about that biblical expression of seeking the welfare of the city?
Well, I think you do balance things. I mean, in this sense, I joke about Australia that it's not a real country. It's like 5 city-states, and you do see that. I mean, for me, for example, if you live in Perth, you know full well that your state is incredibly wealthy because of mining and so on, and also because of the GST rebate that Perth managed brilliantly to negotiate, and which they're never going to give up. But, I'll tell you, maybe they should think of the rest of the country as well. Maybe we should think of the wider world. There are a whole bunch of different things that we're talking about. However, having said that, I would still come back to this. If I was able to vote here, I would write each of the candidates in my constituency, and I would vote for the one that I thought would be best for the constituency. Now, that does include their national party affiliation. It does include other things. But I remember, again, back in Dundee in Scotland, there was a Liberal Democrat councillor who I normally would never have voted for them because of their national policies, but the local councillor was brilliant, so I voted for him. I voted for an SNP, a Scottish National Party MP, although I disagreed strongly with a lot of the policies. And another time, I voted for a Conservative member of the European Parliament. And people would say that was inconsistency. For me, it was consistent because I was looking at their particular policies, their gifts, their abilities, and whether they'd be good for our area. And I think that people should do that. I mean, I know instantly there are some people, I mean, I wouldn't do it here. I actually went through a list of local candidates here, and I thought, okay, there are at least 6 I've scratched off straight away. So I wouldn't say who they are, but I know you can work those out for yourself.
Yep.
But the others I want to listen to and find out and say, okay, tell me where you're coming from, tell me what you're going to do. And so on.
And, of course, we have our preferential voting system. So there's ways you can give some preference to that particular candidate that you do really want to stand for. And the best of the bad bunch might be a little bit down the list, but you're going to put your preferences in some sort of order. David Robertson, great getting your insights as always. I said... when I was introducing this segment a little earlier, it could be confronting and refreshing at the same time. I think you've delivered. Very confronting, very refreshing too. You're the leader of the Scots-Kirk Presbyterian Church in Newcastle in New South Wales. I think I saw your name on the list to be one of those churches where there's going to be a Meet the Candidate forum. Is that
right?
That is the case?
That is the case. Yeah, we're doing that. I mean, I think a standard for the church is this. I remember, again, a general election in the UK, and my church was a polling station. So outside, all the parties were there with their brochures or banners or whatever as people were coming in to vote. And I noticed 2 of my own congregation. One was Labour, I think one was Conservative. And I laughed because both of them thought I was voting for them. And I thought that's the way I want it to be. I mean, I basically had people of every political persuasion in my congregation. And I think that's not a bad way to be. But I also think that this is a crucial election for Australia, and we need to pray that the Lord would protect this great nation and protect our freedoms within it, that we would have freedom to proclaim the gospel.
Smiling at everyone as you're walking into the polling booth and voting according to your Christian conscience, which is all these different dimensions that we've been talking about today. You could keep an eye out for theweeflea.com. You can find all sorts of great articles that David's written. He's a blogger, theweeflea.com. His latest book is called Seek. David Robertson, thanks so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your insights with us today on 2020.
Great. It's good to be with you. And, we'll keep praying about the election. Actually, on my podcast, I'm just put out in a couple of weeks an Australian election special. So I'll reflect. This conversation is very helpful to me, and I'll reflect a bit more on all that's happening.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.